Thank you, Matt. Good evening, everyone. For those I haven't met, my name is Carl Granke. I'm senior planner with the town, and I'd like to acknowledge and welcome WSP Consultants. They're the team that the town has hired to lead the zoning bylaw review. I'd like to acknowledge Mary Remig, the planning coordinator, and Carrie Costello, the clerk, director of corporate services, here from Town Hall, joining us this evening, and also councillors Lorraine Allen, Nikki Dwyer, Jay Brennan, and Wendy Alford, who've also joined. And I'd like to thank everyone here, of course, for coming in as well. So the zoning bylaw is, of course, one of the most important planning documents that we use to guide how we want to see the town develop and our neighborhoods evolve, and it is truly a team approach. So I think what we learn and what we discuss today will certainly be very helpful in guiding the next steps of the review. So I'll turn it back over to Matt.
And I will turn it right back over to Nadia to kick us off this evening.
Great. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Matt. Hello and good evening, councillors and participants. Thanks for taking some time out tonight. My name is Nadia DeSanti. I am a practice lead, a land use planner out of the Ottawa office, and I'm accompanied by my colleague Anita Sott, who is a senior planner working on this file, and Matt Rodriguez, who's our consultant facilitator, and our colleague Jill McDonald, who's a planner as well, working on this project on behalf of the town. So we have a somewhat short presentation just to get everybody grounded, and then Matt will lead us into some activities through a tool. So we'll just like to move on to the next slide. So today, oh, sorry, Matt, this is back to you. Pardon me.
No
sorry,
worries.
I had another committee meeting today, so I'm just using that, still using that format. So sorry, you go ahead.
All good. And as Carl and Nadia sort of framed the team, and just want to give an overview of today's session, and also just a reminder that the event is being recorded as well as live streamed. So welcome to everyone who's joined us on another platform as well. So there'll be lots of opportunities to review this once we're done. We'll go over that presentation to start that Nadia mentioned. We'll spend about 20 minutes on that. And really, as Nadia said, ground people in the project, orient everyone on terminology and what we're looking at through this project. And then we're going to spend the bulk of this evening on a workshop, and we're going to cover 4 topics, being additional residential units, downtown parking, short-term accommodations. And we'll get into all the details on those as we get into the presentation and get to each topic. And through this, we're going to be using an interactive tool, which I'll explain momentarily. After that, we'll have an opportunity for, other brainstorming or other issues and anything else really that you want to talk about with respect to the zoning bylaw review project. And then we'll wrap up with some next steps and go from there. Next slide, please. So we've done a brief introduction here to the team, but it really is a collaborative effort to bring together the zoning bylaw review. So you've already met Carl from the town and Mary as well, who are our project leads at the town, and we'll be providing that oversight and review of all of the project. Then there's WSP, and I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Matt Rodriguez with WSP, and so I'm part of the consulting team, and we'll be bringing together that bylaw and delivering some of these public engagement activities over the coming months. We're also working with our partners at CGIS, and they're the folks who pull together the maps and all the data that really feeds into the zoning bylaw review project. So it's a great team effort working together to deliver on this project. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I know. I felt I was breaking it.
So just before we get started, and maybe some housekeeping items here, we do ask that folks remain muted while the presenter is speaking. until called upon during the Q&A session, and that just helps us get through and without interruptions. We'd also suggest that if you're experiencing any connection issues or anything maybe weird with the Zoom, we suggest turning off your camera. Sometimes that helps with your bandwidth. If you have a question or would like to speak, feel free to use the raise hand feature, and there's a little icon here at the bottom of your screen. You should see your reactions button, and that'll allow you to raise your hand. If that's not an option for you, or you prefer to use the chat box, we'd also welcome you to use the chat box at any time during the session to put your comment or question. And we'll get to those at key milestones of the presentation, pardon me. And so we'll certainly save all those questions and get to them at the end. As I mentioned, a recording will be posted following the session, and it is being live streamed on a number of different platforms. So again, thanks to everyone who's been able to join us. Next slide, please. All right, here's the fun part. So as part of today's workshop, and to kind of make it a little more interactive for the group, we're using a really cool tool called Mentimeter to get your input and to participate in some live polls. So we're going to do a bit of a test right now. So if you, on your smartphone or on a tablet or on your computer, you can visit www.menti.com. And Jill, if possible, would you be able to put that link in the chat box just for folks to have as a reference? And so you can visit that and enter the code when prompted on your screen, 34317176. Or you can take the camera on your smartphone or tablet and scan the QR code, the pixelated looking image on your right, and that'll take you directly to our live poll for this workshop. If you're joining us via the live stream, you're also welcome to use this as well and follow along with us. If you're watching a recording, unfortunately, the polling will be closed by that time, but we certainly welcome your feedback via email or as a follow-up to this meeting. So give everyone a second to get oriented here. If for some reason there's any issues with that, you're also welcome to use the chat box for that. And there is a link in the chat box right now, as well as the code. And we'll remind everyone of this throughout, and this code and link stay the same throughout all our activities, so it doesn't change. You can stay on the same page. We'll give everyone a minute here just to get oriented and perhaps access the tool, and then we'll do a little test before we dive into the presentation. Okay, maybe head over there, Jill. All right, so just to warm everyone up, get everyone familiarized with the platform, you should see a question come up on your device or wherever you've accessed the tool this evening, asking, how did you hear about today's workshop? So there's a few options, the Town of Smith Falls webpage, the newspaper notice, word of mouth, maybe it was talked about on between friends, maybe that's social media. Just helps us understand maybe where we, where folks are hearing about things, and we can work on that for next time as well. So it looks like a few answers are coming in, so you should be able to see those coming up live on your screen as they do. So a few people learning about it on the webpage, as well as some others via word of mouth and maybe some other venues. As you can see in the bottom right here, we have 5 people contributing, and so maybe see if anyone else chimes in. Otherwise, that might be our benchmark number for some of the activities as we go into the evening. Okay, looks like we've perhaps slowed down on some of the answers. So I think without further ado, I'll pass it over to Nadia to jump into the presentation, and I'll see you back at the workshop.
Thanks, Matt. So today's workshop is to introduce the zoning bylaw review project, and also to collaboratively gather input on specific zoning topics, including additional residential units, downtown parking. There's been a lot of studies done and discussions about that, so we're going to continue that conversation. We'd also like to hear from you on short-term accommodations and really any other land use zoning issues that anyone wants to raise. And the input of today's workshop will inform the key issues for the updated zoning bylaw document that will be shared for sure with the public, and we'll get into that later in terms of the process and next steps. So this is the planning hierarchy here in Ontario. So on the left-hand side, you see the Planning Act, and that's the enabling legislation. So that's the document, that's the law that enables land use planning to be undertaken in Ontario. And it really sets the ground rules for land use planning. And then that also identifies matters of provincial interest, which is further expanded upon in what we call the provincial policy statement. And that document it gets renewed every so often, usually with municipal government changes sometimes. So this one is new as of last spring. And it gets into the details of provincial interests such as natural heritage, housing supply, economic development, all sorts of areas. So then that is sort of the next here. And then those matters of provincial interest get further defined in an official plan. And so the town of Smiths Falls official plan is basically it's the vision. It sets out the land use options. It sort of not sort of, but it does describe, where residential should go, where commercial should go, where the parks, those sorts of things. And it contains other policies with respect to natural environment, heritage, and how do we manage growth and development. And then we get into the zoning bylaw, which is the topic of today's presentation. The zoning bylaw is the legal tool that implements the land use designations that are found in the official plan. So it gets into more details about properties. How do you build a property? How far do you need to be from a street? How far do you need to be from your neighbor? How high can you go? What amount of parking does development or a use need to be provided, all of those things. And so it is a very technical document, but it really is, as Carl said, a really important document because this really establishes how a property, what gets built on there, how does that get built, get done. And it can also be, let's say you want to build a deck or you want to put in a garage. The zoning bylaw also provides direction on some of those other smaller features that are found on a property. So it's not just the main building, but it does provide direction on other components that you may find on a property. So as I mentioned, what is a zoning bylaw or ZBL? So we're going to get into what are the permitted land uses, where do accessory structures go, where do the driveways go, how wide can your driveways go, where should those driveways be located? So it's all those finite details. So it's kind of almost like, not quite a Lego example, but in a way, yes, right? You start with your property, your base Lego piece, and then you're adding to it. And so where do you put those pieces? So I don't think I've ever used the Lego reference, but there you go. First time for everything. So Lego reference in describing a zoning bylaw. So it's putting all those pieces together on a piece of property. And this is a document that dictates or guides how you can do that. So specifically the zoning bylaw, and on the right, you'll see the existing town zoning bylaw. It has what's called zones. So in the official plan, it's called designations, but in the zoning bylaw, it's zones. And it identifies a number of zones: residential, commercial, industrial, and they're illustrated on schedules or maps. And then within each zone, it lists what types of uses are permitted And then in each zone, it also includes, again, those development standards on, how you can develop a property. So we often include figures in zoning bylaws to explain, because it is a technical document, and sometimes it can be a bit challenging to interpret. So figures are always a good way of helping to visualize, what do we mean by front yard? What do we mean by side lot line? What do we mean by building height? And what if you have different roof types, which is what the bottom right illustration shows. So again, it's, we're happy to hear comments throughout tonight and through the process. If you use a zoning bylaw, or if you haven't, it might be a fun little test to see how your site is zoned, and see if you can actually navigate through it. And that's a good test for us too, to see and understand and hear, this is really challenging, don't understand this. That actually is very beneficial, to hear what works and what doesn't. So we try to use simple language. We try to use illustrations, but sometimes having another perspective or another set of eyes, if you will, can also be really important. I'm going to turn it over to Anita now to present a couple of slides.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nadia. So to further discuss why the zoning bylaw is being reviewed this year at this time, we wanted to mention that the town's current zoning bylaw was last approved by council in 1994, and since then there have been some amendments through approved zoning bylaw amendments and consolidations of those amendments. And town staff last performed a consolidation in June of this year, so just this past summer. Under the Planning Act, a zoning bylaw for all municipalities must be updated to conform with the town's official plan, or that municipality's official plan, within 3 years of a new official plan coming into effect. The updated zoning bylaw for the town will also implement specific recommendations from recently approved town plans and studies, including the 2020 downtown parking study and the 2020 housing report. Next slide, please. More specifically, the town's zoning bylaw requires some updates to conform to the town's 2016 official plan, the title page of which is on the slide here, as well as some recently updated provincial regulations, including to the Planning Act. We also will be ensuring that definitions and zoning requirements are contemporary and based on best practices. So some updates may be required since the mid-1990s. And we'll be reviewing site-specific exceptions. And these are zoning provisions which apply only to specific properties in the town. And through this process, we'll be determining if those exceptions are still relevant and should be maintained in the bylaw, or perhaps if they can be deleted if a property has been fully built out. We will also be looking to generally improve the user friendliness of the bylaw document and its clarity. And one method of doing this will be adding illustrations to certain provisions that Nadia just spoke to. Next slide. The image on the slide here is an illustration of the key phases of the zoning bylaw review process that our team will be following with town staff, and including planned community engagement events, as well as key deliverables or documents that will be issued for public review primarily on the town's website for the project. So we are right at the beginning of the whole review process. We're currently in phase 1. And to date, we've kicked off the project with town staff, and we've prepared a draft discussion paper, which has been posted on the town's project website as of August 3rd. And tonight's workshop will help inform some of the zoning issues that are discussed in that discussion paper. Moving to phase 2 this fall, there will be a council presentation in September, I believe it's September 7th, where we will be formally introducing the project to town council and we'll be reporting back on the outcomes and the feedback that we receive from participants in tonight's workshop. Following that, we will prepare what we call a zoning strategy report. And this is in advance of progressing to actually drafting the new zoning bylaw. That strategy report will cover more specific recommendations that we will be making for consideration by the town council and the public for key changes and updates to the actual zoning bylaw document. Then over the fall and winter in phase 3, we will begin preparing the actual draft zoning bylaw, and that will be presented at a public open house in early 2022. Lastly, the review process will conclude with a 4th phase where the zoning bylaw document will be finalized, a statutory public meeting will be held, and then the final zoning bylaw will be presented to council for consideration of adoption. Next slide. So as I mentioned, a draft discussion paper was prepared and posted on the town's project website. This paper examines the town's existing zoning bylaw and identifies some of the key zoning issues and opportunities that we and town staff see as being able to be addressed through this project. So the paper contains a general overview of the current planning and land use policy context in Smiths Falls, the structure of the existing zoning bylaw, the relationship between or how the zoning bylaw implements the official plan, land use designations, and policies, and importantly, key zoning issues that will be reviewed and considered, such as the overall document format and its structure, definitions of key terms used throughout the bylaw, provisions to permit additional residential units under the Planning Act, consideration of revisions to any parking provisions that may be necessary, and to address some items and concepts that many municipalities are covering off in their zoning bylaws, including shipping containers, tiny homes, short-term accommodations, and other potential updates to the bylaw that have been highlighted by town planning staff for consideration based on their day-to-day experience implementing and administering the zoning bylaw in the community. Next slide, please. So that concludes the presentation portion of this evening. Before we move on to the workshop, we would like to invite you to use the chat box at this time to submit any questions that you might have for us so far on the overall zoning bylaw review purpose or the process that we've described. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the workshop, so any other questions, we'd like you to hold them until then, and we will answer all questions that we receive either in the chat box or if anyone would like to speak up during the Q&A at that time. So we'll give a short minute or two to enter your questions, and I'll turn it over to Matt to kick off the interactive portion of this evening using more of that Mentimeter tool.
Thanks, Anita. Give everyone maybe a second here. And maybe while people are, if anyone does have any questions or comments while they're typing them, I'll just introduce the workshop and then pass it over to Anita or Nadia, depending on the topic, to walk through. So how this is going to work is we're covering 3 topics, and we're going to follow generally a consistent format for each topic. So what we're going to do is one of the WSP staff is going to provide an introduction to the topic, get everyone familiar with what we mean by, in this case, additional residential units. We'll give some background. We will explain what the topic is, maybe what the issue is, and why we're looking at it through the zoning bylaw review. And then we'll also explain how that issue or topic is addressed in the existing official plan. And so that's, as Anita mentioned in her presentation, a really key document for us as we look to update zoning standards. We'll then also maybe highlight a couple best practice experiences from other municipalities to understand what other jurisdictions are doing and maybe where Smiths Falls can fit into that. Well, then once we've gotten through all the information and presented those resources for everyone, we're going to walk through a few interactive questions for each topic. Again, as Anita mentioned, using the Mentimeter tool that we used for that icebreaker question at the beginning. So we'll go through that 3 times, and then we'll come back together for a question and answer period. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Anita to kick it off for the additional residential units, and then we'll regroup to work through the activity. So Anita, take it away.
Thank you. So our first topic, as Matt mentioned, is additional residential units. And in planning terms, sometimes they're referred to with the acronym ARUs. You might have heard of these types of units formerly being referred to as secondary dwellings or second units. Some municipalities used to refer to them as accessory apartments. So in general, they are self-contained residential units that are either located within a primary dwelling, for example, a single detached home, or within a building or structure that is ancillary to a dwelling, such as a garage or a coach house. So ancillary in this case means a structure that is related to the primary building on the property. Additional residential units all should have a private kitchen, bathroom facility, and sleeping area. And this is a definition based in the Planning Act. Next slide, please. There have been recent changes to the Planning Act that require all municipalities in Ontario to permit up to 2 additional residential units in their official plan policies and then implemented in their zoning bylaws. So in effect, this means that up to 3 dwelling units can be permitted on a lot in relationship to a specific type of primary dwelling. So I will go and explain in further detail the image at the right, which is provided by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. But first, I want to explain the 3 dwelling units a little bit more. So the first dwelling unit on a property would be that primary dwelling. And under the Planning Act, this can be either a single detached, semi-detached, or a row house or townhouse dwelling. So the first additional residential unit that's permitted under the Planning Act would be within one of those primary dwellings. So if you can imagine a basement apartment, like shown in the top right picture, or pardon me, in the top left, or an upper story apartment within that dwelling shown in the upper right. The second type of additional residential unit that could be permitted on that same lot would be within a structure that is detached from that primary dwelling. So for example, at the bottom right, we are showing a picture of perhaps a detached garage or a tiny home on the same lot as that primary single semi or row house unit. Next slide, please. So as I sort of explained, there are 2 broad types of additional residential units under the Planning Act. Again, either attached additional residential units, such as an upper or lower level apartment, or even an addition to a house, and a detached additional residential unit in a detached structure. And again, examples include a garage apartment, a tiny home or a garden home, or a laneway house. The Smiths Falls zoning bylaw, like all zoning bylaws for municipalities in Ontario, can set out specific regulations for additional residential units, but it must permit the 2 additional residential units on a lot. Next slide. So to give everyone a sense of what a zoning bylaw can and cannot regulate with respect to additional residential units under the Planning Act, a zoning bylaw cannot say whether or not additional residential units are permitted in general. Again, the legislation requires that municipalities permit up to 2 additional residential units on a lot. Zoning cannot dictate whether the primary dwelling is occupied by the owner or not. It cannot dictate the architecture of an additional residential unit or the building materials that are used on the exterior of that building. On the other hand, zoning can regulate the distance of a building, including a detached additional residential unit structure from neighboring lot lines on that property. It can dictate the maximum and minimum floor area of that additional residential unit and the number of parking spaces that may be required for that additional residential unit. Next slide. So to give everyone a sense of what the existing Smiths Falls official plan and zoning bylaw permit, the official plan currently allows for only one additional residential unit, or as the OP refers to it, a second residential unit. And this is currently permitted in detached, semi-detached, and row houses in new and existing neighborhoods. So that's the official plan policy. The current zoning bylaw refers to second residential units, or now called additional residential units, as accessory apartments. So currently in the zoning, accessory apartments are permitted in a single detached house only, as long as the unit does not occupy an entire story within that dwelling, and it shares at least two of the following with the primary dwelling unit: a building entrance, the parking area, and a private amenity area like a backyard. So there is some disconnect right now between the 1990s zoning bylaw and the official plan, which was updated in 2016. If we can go to the next slide. Based on a recent recommendation from that housing report I referenced that was completed in 2020, the Housing Advisory Committee has recommended that the town initiate a process to update both the official plan and the zoning bylaw to permit additional residential units in accordance with changes made to the Planning Act. So the official plan and zoning bylaw would be revised to permit up to 2 additional residential units on a lot, as I first explained, that being 1 additional residential unit within the primary dwelling and 1 in an ancillary building or structure. And it's been recommended that these amendments get completed in advance of the completion of the entire zoning bylaw review project, because this is a priority for the Housing Advisory Committee and Council, and it will help to offset housing affordability and create opportunities for residents and property owners to provide additional housing units in the town. Next slide, please. To give you a sense of what other municipalities are doing and how they are adhering to the Planning Act in regulating additional residential units, the City of Guelph zoning bylaw permits ARUs in all zones where a single detached, semi-detached, and on-street townhouse is permitted. Their zoning bylaw also sets out other criteria to regulate the size and location of additional residential units, so there are setbacks and a maximum number of bedrooms. The township of Ignace, which is in Northern Ontario, the zoning bylaw was recently amended in 2021 to allow for additional residential units and to regulate parking spaces. So they are permitted to be stacked behind the required parking space for the primary dwelling. And an image of that is at the right-hand side of the slide. It's often referred to as tandem parking. And this is required under the Planning Act regulations, where a parking space for an additional residential unit is being required under a municipality zoning bylaw. So in effect, the primary dwelling has a parking space in the driveway, and the additional residential unit, that the vehicle by that occupant can be parked in that same driveway behind or stacked with the primary parking space. Next slide, please. So I'll turn it back over to Matt to lead us through the interactive questions.
Great, thank you, Anita. So to everyone who was with us at the beginning of the presentation, we are using a live poll to get your feedback and your input on these topics. So the link that you used at the beginning of the session remains the same. And if you go to the chat box, the link and the code should still be there at the top of the chat for folks who might need it again. And so for those who joined us, we encourage you to visit www.menti.com on your smartphone, tablet, or computer, and enter the code 34317176 when prompted, or just take the camera of your smartphone or tablet and take a picture of the QR code on the right-hand side of this slide, and it'll take you directly to the activity. If you're having any issues or any trouble getting into the Mentimeter platform, no worries. We still would love your input and feedback on these questions, and you're certainly welcome to use the chat box to do so, or save it for the Q&A, and we can have that at the end. Go to the next slide there, Jill. So our first question perhaps is an easy one. just to get everyone oriented. So, do you have any concerns with additional residential units on a lot? Are there any concerns that you have? And on the next slide, we'll have an opportunity for you to type those concerns in and provide that feedback for us. So a few people here saying no concerns. All right, no concerns. Wonderful. Unsure. For sure, there's certainly a lot to, this is a big topic, certainly a lot of maybe technical terms and technical items here. Yes, that's good. We'll have an opportunity on the next activity to provide maybe some more context around that, or any comments or thoughts you might have.
Might just take a second, Matt, to address one of the
Yeah.
questions I'm seeing in the chat. So the question from Jay is, how does the Ontario Building Code influence minimum floor space? And that's a good point, Jay. We should have mentioned in discussing additional residential units that a property owner is expected and required to adhere to the Ontario Building Code and Fire Code when applying for a building permit to build an additional residential unit. So a building permit is required, and I'm not a building official, I'm not an expert on the building code, but there are certainly minimum floor space requirements for dwelling units, windows, fire entrances up to fire code that would be required depending on the development proposed.
Thanks, Anita. Okay, so a few more answers coming in here, and maybe we'll move on to the next question in just a second. So a few people maybe with some concerns, a few people with no concerns, and maybe some people who need a bit more information, which totally understood. So maybe Joe will go to the next question here. So this is your opportunity maybe to provide a bit more text or a bit more, a bit more background. If yes, what concerns do you have? We'd also welcome any, if you were unsure, maybe what you're unsure about. We welcome any input here, and given the size of the group, maybe we can answer some of these questions, or maybe we can tackle some of them. If not, we'll certainly get back to you, as we get through the zoning strategy report and finalize the discussion paper. So hopefully on the Menti, it should be an opportunity with a text box. And as those answers come in, they'll come up live on the screen. And there's our first answer. Okay, so perhaps one of our first concerns is an overcrowded feeling in certain areas. Let's see if any other options come in. Maybe a question here, Anita, in the chat box while we wait for some answers to come in is, are fire separations required, perhaps between the units or when you add an additional residential unit?
Yeah, again, I'm not a building official, so I don't want to overstep. I do believe fire separations are required because they are separate apartments. So a building permit would be required, and that would be reviewed as part of that process. There is a handy guide that I will put the link to in the chat box that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing published. It refers to the old term second units, but many of the rules are the same. And that guide goes through a lot of useful information in terms of building code requirements and fire code requirements.
Great. So a couple other comments coming in here around how close to property lines. So, I think the bylaw certainly has a role to play in setting out where an additional residential unit can be on a lot. So, if it's in the main building, it's subject to the main building requirements of the principal house. But if it's in the detached, if it's in maybe a little structure or in the garage or in a tiny house, there's certainly an opportunity to set out those types of regulations within a zoning bylaw. Another comment here, maybe a few concerns here. So density, road safety, infrastructure for more traffic, so the size of streets, and then perhaps the impacts on green space, backyards being eliminated, and impacts to neighbors. So I also see Anita's popped into the chat box the link to the building code handy guide about additional residential units if folks have any more detailed questions about that. So yeah, thanks everyone for contributing to some of your thoughts here. Okay, Joe, maybe in the interest of time, I'll head on to the next question. All right, so one thing we want to know, and Anita briefly touched on this topic during the presentation, is around parking. And so the question here is, should an additional residential unit have a dedicated parking space in addition to the parking required for the primary dwelling unit? So, for example, if you have a single detached house, maybe it requires one parking space. Do we require a second parking space for the additional residential unit? Or does it have to find parking elsewhere or be accommodated otherwise on the site? All right, so generally overwhelming support for yes, that there should be an additional parking space. One coming in no. So perhaps, by, in terms of, what are the pros and cons? If you do require that additional parking space, maybe that limits someone's ability to add an additional residential unit on their lot. But if you don't require parking space, maybe there's parking concerns on the site. So certainly some things to balance here. All right. So almost a 50-50 split here. We're gonna have to have another workshop and do like runoffs on some of these questions. And this will be something that we'll be talking about in the zoning strategy report as a follow-up and understanding what those requirements might be. Okay, see answers slowing down, maybe give it a few more seconds here. Glad to see the Menti tools working for folks, and hopefully no one's had any major issues getting into it if to this point. All right, so no more runoff needed. So a few more people here recommending yes, there should be an additional residential or additional parking space for that unit. So this is good feedback. All right, Joe, maybe we'll go on to the next slide, please. All right, so thanks for talking through the additional residential units topic. I'm gonna pass it over to Nadia to walk through a few things all about downtown parking.
Thanks, Matt. And continuing on parking discussion, but in a different location. So the next few slides will be providing an overview on the work that's been done to date. Many of you may have participated in the past study, and then Matt will lead us through some questions. So parking is a big component in zoning, and it is where the municipality can establish the number of parking spaces that would require, the size. So some municipalities, so like there's regular parking space requirements, but then some municipalities are even providing size requirements for small cars. Of course, barrier-free spaces have a different requirement as well. And we also look at parking and loading areas, right? So for those uses that require loading areas, we get into, the size of those as well. Then we also look at location of off-street parking spaces. And last year, the town completed a downtown core parking study, and it looked at all the properties that are illustrated within the yellow boundary to the right-hand side. And that study made 9 recommendations, including the ones that here on the screen. So I'm just going to explain them. So accessible barrier-free parking requirements. So, those are often with a wider parking space. Sometimes there's that painted strip in between the two spaces. There are different ways of accommodating that. Then shared parking requirements, which means if there is a, 2 uses that maybe have different operating hours, instead of having each use require their number of parking spaces and the second use requiring their spaces, maybe there's a shared parking rate or shared amount that could be provided. And of course, we have to consider bicycle parking standards. So if it's an office use or an apartment use or retail use, you know, how many bicycle parking spaces or should be provided, where should those be? So that's part of the zoning when we're talking about parking, and the cash in lieu of parking. So this is where a proposed development comes forward, and for whatever reason, could be the size of the lot, for example, that they are not able to provide parking, that they would make a payment to the municipality for cash in lieu. So it's cash in lieu of a parking space. So that is what that means. Moving on to the next slide. So a little bit more information on shared parking. So again, this is sharing the spaces from different land uses, and it can be at different times of the day or days of the week. And really the shared parking is to reduce the number of parking spaces that are required for each of those land uses at a site or area. Usually these are used in mixed use settings such as downtowns. And the example here is from the town of Grimsby, pardon me, the shared parking formula. And so these percentages, again, can vary. They can change for whatever makes sense to the municipality. So for example, you would have, so on the left-hand side, for example, are the different land uses. So apartment, building, restaurant, retail store. And what the table is showing is, okay, 80% of the parking area would be occupied for the apartment building dwellers during the morning and in the PM afternoon. But in the evening, assuming everybody goes back home, it's 100% used. But the flip side would be an office. Now pretend there's no pandemic, where in the morning you'd probably have the parking lot at 100% capacity used by vehicles. In the afternoon, probably a little bit less depending on people's work schedules. But for the most part in the evening, you're going to only have 15% of those spaces occupied by those employees. Maybe there are, you know, people who come to clean the offices. So, you know, there's very few parking spaces that would be required. So that's kind of the concept of a shared parking situation. So right now, the town's existing zoning bylaw doesn't provide provisions for the accessible or barrier-free parking, doesn't have any kind of requirements for bicycle parking or shared parking. So what other municipalities are doing, so here are just a couple of examples. First one being the town of East Willemberry zoning bylaw from last year. They've actually set out bicycle parking provisions for commercial, institutional, and multi-unit residential units. And they've allowed reduced motor vehicle parking requirements in employment zones where bicycle parking is provided. So again, that's what they've chosen to do. And the town of Grimsby zoning bylaw from 2 years ago sets out parking provisions specific to the downtown and the mixed use zones. So what they're requiring is only an 80% reduction of downtown commercial parking requirements for new developments. In the mixed use zones, required parking can be shared. So that whole percentage table idea. And they've included bicycle parking requirements that is based on the percentage of the motor vehicle parking requirements for non-residential uses. So there are different ways of establishing these requirements for bicycle parking. Town of Grimsby used that. Some will have X number of spaces per unit. There's different ways of actually including those provisions. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to lead us through a series of questions in relation to the downtown parking topic.
Great, thank you so much, Nadia. And to everyone who is still with us, it's the same access code, same link as before, but for perhaps those who haven't been able to join us, you can visit www.menti.com and enter the code on your screen, or use the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen to access the live poll. And we'll walk through a few questions to get your input and thoughts on some topics on the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so just to kind of get a pulse of things, do you have concerns with off-street parking availability in the downtown core? So, you know, when you're going downtown, do you maybe find it hard to find a parking space? Are they always full? Are they too small? Are they in a bad location? I don't know. What are those concerns? All right, so a few answers coming in here. So a few people with yes, there are some concerns. Maybe about 50% right now, maybe no concerns with off-street parking. So this is, you know, parking lots. We're not talking about, you know, those on-street parking spaces in front of a store or on the road. We're talking about the off-street parking here. Unsure, understood, and hopefully if you have any questions, if you're unsure, happy if you have any questions, we'd love it if you're able to pose those in the chat box, or certainly save those to the Q&A. Okay, a few answers here. So perhaps a majority-ish saying, you know, no concerns at this time with off-street parking in the downtown core. But certainly that, you know, certainly still something we can look at through this zoning bylaw review. Okay. 50-50 again, one more runoff gonna have to happen. All right, thanks for your contributions so far. Give everyone a second here. All right, Jill, I think we'll go on to the next question here. All right, so this is a bit of a fun activity, and I'll explain it, and hopefully it makes sense on your device. So we want to know, are there specific times of the day or days of the week where you've noticed a shortage of parking in specific areas? So you'll see some sliders on your phone. On the right-hand side, you've seen some issues. Maybe there's some concerns with, you know, no availability. On the left side, I don't know what side you're seeing on my screen. On the left side of the slider, so there's no concerns. And we have 4 different times of day: morning, so that's 6 a.m. to 11 a.m., midday, afternoon, and evening. And we want to know how parking changes throughout the day. And so this question is going to take folks maybe a bit of time to complete. So we'll give everyone that time. And I'll pull it up on my phone while we chat, just to make sure I'm speaking correctly. Yeah, so on the left-hand side, lots of spaces available. On the right-hand side, no spaces available. And somewhere in the middle, you know, maybe it's okay, you know, you're indifferent, unsure. Okay, we're seeing some answers coming in. So perhaps mornings on weekdays, there's some greater concern. Some concerns maybe on weekends, in the afternoons, midday and morning on weekdays, evenings and afternoons on weekends. And the reason we're trying to get to this information is so Nadia presented that table that showed all those percentages and those split rates. So, you know maybe the cinema doesn't need you know, parking on, you know, Monday to Friday between, you know, in the morning and then lunch hour, but, you know, in the afternoon and evening it gets busy at the cinema. But then the office doesn't need, you know, on the same lot, the office doesn't need parking at that time. So, you know, this just gets us thinking about where those constraints might be, and you know, maybe where there are some challenges with parking. And on our side, we'll get some more specific data about this little grid that's being built, that we can understand where those constraints might be.
Yeah, I was gonna mention a good comment in the chat box
Oh.
that it's tough to say during the pandemic. So I think we would suggest if we can all hopefully turn our minds back to pre-pandemic times and the usual sort of traffic and circulation and
Movie
parking
theaters,
habits
restaurants.
at that time. Yeah, did you experience parking shortages in 2019, very early 2020? Hopefully we will all return to those times at some point.
That's a great, great comment. Okay, so we typically don't hit more than 7. So just to kind of maybe summarize what we're seeing here. So maybe on both evening or weekdays and weekends, there's concerns in the midday. Maybe a little bit less of a concern in the mornings and afternoons. Mornings and evenings. But on weekends, the afternoons, there might be some shortage of parking. So again, this isn't an exact or precise science, but just trying to gauge people's, thoughts on where there's those shortages and, maybe prompt some other input that you might have. Okay, we'll go to the next question there, Joe. All right, so as Nadia mentioned in the presentation, we are looking to introduce bike parking standards or bike parking space requirements within the zoning bylaw. And, we just want to know, would the introduction of bike parking make it easier to bike to destinations? So, maybe you have a favorite restaurant or a community space or a bookstore that you like to bike to, but it's not feasible right now because there isn't anywhere to lock that bike up to. So maybe it'll be a bit easier to do that, and just trying to understand, see if there's that general support to be able to bike places within town. Okay, so generally some supportive yeses that might be feasible to bike, maybe a bit easier to bike to some key destinations. A few people maybe not, a few people unsure, and there's certainly more to biking than bike parking, but certainly a factor that weighs into people's decision making. Towns the size of Smiths Falls have such an advantage, not that far to go to get to maybe the key places that you like to get to from where you live. So certainly an opportunity to harness here if people are coming to visit downtown and want to be able to bike. Okay, Jill, maybe we'll go to the next question here. Okay, so what we're trying to understand is, what are some, when you think of shared parking, so remember we mentioned that maybe not the same use needs this amount of parking all day long and there's an opportunity to share. Is there, what are some types of downtown uses that could share their parking, that are a bit more cyclical or a bit more, the parking needs change perhaps throughout the day, throughout the week, on different days of the week, weekdays versus weekends? Okay, so commercial, so in that we've included, retail, office, personal service like hair salons, institutional, including schools. There really isn't anyone parked at a school on a Saturday in the dead of July, so maybe there's an opportunity to share there. Parks and open space, typically more busy during the day, perhaps less so in the evening and at night. And probably reflected well in this science is, the residential uses. Maybe people are at work during the day, so that there's an opportunity to share things there. So, okay, we've hit our number 8. That's our good benchmark number there in the bottom right-hand corner. All right, I think that wraps up the downtown parking questions. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Anita to talk about short-term accommodations. Oh,
sorry.
There we go.
Always classic. Someone has to be muted. So next slide, please. I'll dive in. Okay, so short-term accommodations or short-term rentals is a topic that we wanted to broach with some community members. So these generally refer to privately owned properties, so privately owned homes that a property owner decides to rent, and typically on an online platform such as Airbnb or VRBO is another common one. And there are various benefits that short-term accommodations can provide, both to the community at large, say to encourage tourism and different accommodation options, but also benefits to the property owners themselves, so providing some supplementary income. But these uses can also present some challenges in municipalities. So some of these challenges experienced elsewhere have been nuisances or concerns in terms of nuisance with traffic or noise or party houses, for example. And also some housing affordability and supply concerns in some locations across Ontario. So if a lot of private property owners are choosing to rent via a short-term rental platform, effectively that property is no longer on the rental market for a long-term lease for someone. So it does affect housing supply in some jurisdictions. So the town currently does not regulate short-term accommodations like Airbnb, either through its official plan, zoning bylaw, or through other municipal tools. And the town is currently considering and looking for feedback from the community and from council on whether regulations need to be introduced if there's new or emerging community concerns around this topic. There are also other tools other and separate from the zoning bylaw that some municipalities use to regulate short-term accommodations. And this includes simply enforcing property standards bylaws that are already in place. So things like garbage and the appearance of a property, noise bylaws, so keeping quiet hours after a certain time of day, and requiring licenses and registration or permits for those property owners that choose to rent out their properties through a separate licensing bylaw. Next slide, please. So the zoning bylaw in terms of accommodation types currently regulates hotels, motels, guest houses, and bed and breakfasts. And those are some of the more traditional accommodation types in a municipality. As I mentioned, the zoning bylaw does not currently regulate other types of short-term accommodations. So those Airbnb rentals, whether it's a room in someone's house or their entire residential unit. In addition, the town does not currently require a license, registration, or permit for property owners to be able to operate short-term accommodations out of their home or their property. Next slide. So municipalities are tackling this issue in a variety of ways. In some municipalities, it's simply not an issue and there aren't really an overwhelming amount of public concerns. So some municipalities are staying silent on this, not regulating it in any kind of meaningful way, and property owners are generally free to do as they wish with their units. In some other jurisdictions, there have been some community concerns, so they've been addressed in a variety of ways, depending on what municipality we're looking at. So I'll provide a couple examples here, but this is certainly not an extensive and comprehensive list of every municipality and what is out there. So City of St. Catharines, quite recently, a couple years ago, permitted in their zoning bylaw short-term accommodations via a phased rollout that will begin in January of next year. So short-term accommodation operators or those private property owners will be required to obtain a business license in order to operate a short-term accommodation. They will be allowed in residential areas, provided that they are not the primary use of the property. So the primary use would have to still be that private property's residential unit. And they will be permitting a short-term accommodation to operate out of any residence for a rental period not to exceed 28 days. So they have stipulated a time limit on the rental. And the second, the short-term accommodation must be a secondary use of the property as a home-based business. And it's also required to be the primary residence of the operator or the owner or the tenant. So you may have heard the term ghost hotels in some municipalities or in the news. It's a situation that we're kind of knowledgeable about in Ottawa because that's where the majority of our team members live. And in Ottawa, it was pretty common that these rentals were not being lived in by the primary property owner, and they were being rented out as an income property, and that resulted in some housing supply concerns across the city and rising rent prices as well. So Ottawa is another example where the municipality has recently introduced a zoning bylaw amendment to regulate short-term accommodations, and the property owner will be required to have a host permit, and it will have to be their primary dwelling unit, and there's also a limit on the number of overnight guests. And then a third municipality is Collingwood, and in this case, this is a little bit dated, but their current zoning bylaw only permits short-term accommodations in those traditional bed and breakfasts. Next slide, please. So again, I'll be passing this over to Matt, and this is really the town's first attempt to get some community feedback on this issue. It's not necessarily something that's been studied in the past, like downtown parking or housing recommendations in general by the Housing Advisory Committee. So quite a new topic that we'd like to begin some dialogue on.
Great, thank you so much, Anita. And this is our last workshop cluster, and then we'll head into some open Q&A and perhaps any questions that you might have. So again, for those who might be joining us via live stream or have just joined us, we are looking for your input and thoughts on this topic. And if you visit www.menti.com and enter the code 34317176, or scan the code on the right with your smartphone, tablet, or you can use this on your computer as well. This will allow us to get your input and see all the results live on the screen. As well, if that's not working for you or you're unable to use the platform, we'd welcome your comments in the chat box at any time. So as I said, this is our last question, or some of our last questions. So the first question here, do you have any concerns regarding short-term accommodations in Smiths Falls today? What's going on today? If yes, please enter your thoughts in the box below. So this is just an opportunity to type in some text and just share your thoughts in a openly about what those concerns might be, perhaps today about short-term accommodations or going into the future. Anything that you might want us to know about as we think about how the zoning bylaw plays a role in this topic. And so, as Anita said during the presentation, when referring to short-term accommodations, we're thinking, Airbnbs, VRBO, those types of platforms. And so, what have you encountered? A neighbor running an Airbnb out of the house? Do you have concerns there? Have you used a short-term accommodation in Smiths Falls and it didn't end up so well? Yeah, so this is certainly a topic on many people's minds. The first comment here being, could possibly be taking up rentals for people in need of long-term housing. And again, reducing the actual long-term housing accommodations for people in the area. And so, when is it when is the difference between a hotel and a house? So, these properties are no longer available for long-term accommodations. So certainly from a housing perspective, certainly a topic to consider. Okay. And as Anita said, this is just the first, touch point on this topic in the community. Yeah, so if the town allowed short-term housing with certain provisions, enforcement could be an issue. Certainly something to think about. How is this administered? How is it enforced? Who's checking in on these things and enforcing things? And they mentioned Guelph as an example.
Yeah, I think like a lot of other zoning issues, sometimes enforcement comes down to neighbors calling the municipality and making complaints. In other cases, municipalities can be quite proactive in seeking out those short-term accommodations, even scoping out Airbnb themselves and contacting those property owners and asking, hey, do you have a license from the town to operate your business?
Certainly some, nuisance and, property standards concerns. I live in a condominium and my condominium does not allow Airbnbs. It's very explicit in the contract.
So I guess that's an example of a private property owner
Mhm.
regulating their tenants, not necessarily the municipality getting involved and
Mhm.
saying no short-term accommodations. So that's another way of regulating them, but without municipal involvement.
Sure. Okay, it looks like we're perhaps slowing down on some of the answers, but that's totally, again, this is early days on this discussion, and we really appreciate your feedback so far on all these topics. It really does just help us get, a pulse of maybe where the community's at as we head into the next stages of the project. All right, let's go to the next slide there, Jill. All right, so maybe a little bit easier. Next question here, multiple choice. Should the town consider new regulations for short-term accommodations? And the next question will ask maybe what those type of regulations are, but this question is just broadly, should the town consider new regulations? Yes, no, or unsure. And maybe that unsure is you need some more information, or you need to understand what that's all about. All right, so 5 out of our usual 8 is yes. So certainly something we can talk about. And as I said, the next question will be, maybe what are those tools, that we can consider that Anita spoke to in the presentation. So 100% majority here, yes. And certainly something that can be looked at. And as we mentioned, it's there's many different ways to administer it, and lots of consideration by both staff and council in terms of expense and resources and other priorities in the community. All right, so 6 out of 6, yes. Something to consider and to look at for sure. Okay, Jill, maybe we can hop over quickly to I think it's our last question of the workshop. So if new regulations for short-term accommodations or STAs are considered, which tools would you support? And you should be able to select all that apply. So maybe it's a combination of 1 or 2 of both. So maybe there's, regulations within the zoning bylaw, but also the need to register. Maybe, there's no regulations in the zoning bylaw, and, there's some tax, implications for short-term accommodations. Sounds like there's sweeping support for all 3. Oh, thank goodness. But great to, this is, again, we're early days in this conversation. Perhaps a bit of a lead here for regulation in the zoning bylaw. And again, once it's in the zoning bylaw and approved and adopted by council, any changes to that would need to come, through a public process. And so, again, something to think about in terms of resources and, implementation. Okay. Thanks everyone who's been able to contribute so far. Okay, so I think this wraps up the seeing we've hit a bit of our number here, our magic number 7 or 8, and so give everyone a second, and then we'll move on to the sort of the concluding portion and the Q&A of this evening's workshop. Okay, Jill, we can head on to the next slide there. All right, so I haven't seen any hands, shoot up immediately or any burning questions come into the chat box that we haven't had a chance to address. But we wanted to provide just an opportunity to have an open discussion. You know, we focused on 3 key topics today that were of interest to the team and to the town to get your feedback on. But we also want to know what other issues are on your mind and what things that we should be looking at as we continue with the zoning bylaw review. So perhaps just a few prompts here. You know, do you have any questions about the process? You know, do you have questions about when you can get involved? Do you have questions about how we're actually completing the study? Are there other zoning issues not discussed today that you would like to be considered? So, you know, did you come here with a specific question in mind? Be happy to field that, or any other questions or comments. We, you know, certainly welcome that. And this is a really exciting and undoubtedly important project for the town. And this is, as we said, this is the first public touch point and certainly not the last. And there'll be certainly more opportunities once we have more pieces of the puzzle together to take a look at. So as we said before, if you'd like to use the chat box and pop your question or comment in there, we can certainly field that then. Or you can raise your hand. And thanks to Councillor Brennan. Thanks for joining us this evening. Okay. No questions? Really? Okay. Nadia, do you have anything? Oh, there we go.
Development charges fall within the zoning bylaw. So thanks, Jenny. No, the development charges are fall under a different act, and they are done once a year. Usually, the town or the municipality will do a background study, and then the DC charges and for residential and non-residential uses get established. So they're not within the zoning bylaw review process.
Okay. For sure. So the question here from Norm, while I understand these major issues, are there other things the town is looking at for this review? Anita, do you maybe want to highlight some of the things in the discussion paper?
Sure. So there has been, and I referred to a discussion paper that was prepared, and it's about it's quite an extensive document. It's about 50 pages where we've really examined the current zoning bylaw that the town has in place and is currently implementing, and some of the high-level zoning issues that we will be looking at across this process. So certainly not just limited to the 3 that we were discussing today. A bit of background on why we chose the 3. They come from some of the recommendations out of the town studies, so that downtown parking study and the housing report in terms of additional residential units. So they would be new introductions into the town zoning bylaw and not just updates or modifications. So we wanted to introduce them to the community early on, but they are certainly not the only zoning issues that will be looked at in the discussion paper. So Matt has kindly put a direct link to the the town's project website for the zoning bylaw review. And that website contains a PDF of that discussion paper. And we would invite everyone to have a read through it at your leisure over the next few weeks or month or so. Other topics will be writing provisions to implement source water protection requirements that are in the official plan. We mentioned shipping containers. So there is an opportunity through the zoning bylaw review to look at those marine containers or shipping containers that in some municipalities pop up on commercial properties and seem to stick around for a really long time and can be a bit of a nuisance or an eyesore. So zoning bylaw reviews are an opportunity to introduce some regulations in terms of how long a shipping container can stay on a lot, a maximum number of those shipping containers, if they are permitted as a permanent storage use for an accessory to a commercial use or an employment use. Can they be sort of blended into the property? Where could they be situated on that lot so that they're not, within the front yard or facing the street, and that they're landscaped or otherwise disguised? So that's another zoning issue that's been prevalent in some municipalities. We went over certain parking provisions, but there are other aspects to that review. So most municipal zoning bylaws, including the towns, will require a minimum number of parking spaces depending on the use. And some outdated zoning bylaws may not reflect current standards. So perhaps they're requiring too much parking or too little parking dependent on the use. For example, a restaurant. Are those uses resulting in really large and underused surface parking lots? So the zoning bylaw review is an opportunity to have sort of a sweeping overview of those parking requirements based on, development permits, recent developments that the town has approved, and trends in that area. So those are some examples, but the zoning discussion paper definitely goes into further detail, as well as the list of items that the town has identified for consideration, as they are really the experts in implementing and administering their bylaw on a day-to-day basis and working with property owners and developers. And zoning issues come up. No zoning bylaw is ever perfect. And that is why the provincial process allows and requires that it be updated every so often.
Thanks, Anita. An interesting question here from Kelly in the chat box. Interested in the future of the zoning bylaw, but they live in a home that has a front bay window on city property. And so the question is there a grandfather clause in regards to that? And perhaps that's touching on the legal non-conforming and legal non-complying status. We can chat about that.
Yeah, I'm not overly familiar myself with the existing provisions in the bylaw in terms of bay windows quite yet, but I can speak more generally to grandfather clauses and legal non-conforming or non-complying uses. So there will always be a case where a municipality updates their zoning bylaw and perhaps some zoning provisions change, which in the case of new development would prohibit things like a bay window projecting out a certain distance or onto city property. But the permission doesn't really change for existing development. What is on the ground today would become legal non-conforming or legal non-complying. So, you wouldn't have to remove that bay window just because the town implements their new zoning bylaw. But if you were to add, say, another bay window in your home, that window would have to comply in terms of how far it can project from your building wall and where it can project into your setbacks. So grandfather clauses or those legal non-conforming and legal non-complying rights are preserved even when the zoning bylaw gets updated.
Great, thanks so much, Anita. Thanks for the follow-up, Kelly. Yeah, the zoning bylaw will not be requesting that you tear down that bay window when it's done.
And there are, that's a smaller example, but there are situations where, say, a lot size is quite a bit smaller than what the zoning bylaw would require in the residential zone, for example. But it is an existing lot of record in the town, and so the town will not be sterilizing that lot for future development just because it doesn't meet a minimum lot area. So there are always situations where exceptions have to be made for existing lots or existing development as it relates to the zoning bylaw. And I see Carl has his hand up, so I'll turn it over to him for some comments.
Thank you. Yes, the encroachment is an interesting one, and from time to time we do learn about porches, decks, parts of homes that have probably been there for 100 years ago, that have been there for 100 years, situated on municipal property. Often these are discovered when there's a land sale or somebody surveys it, and there's probably hundreds that exist there that we don't know about. So one thing that people do and lawyers often request is the opportunity to enter into an encroachment agreement where the municipality essentially allows that encroachment to continue to exist on municipal property so long as we don't need it. And then there's provisions in there that we allow that to happen and allow some landscaping and obviously look at things like liability and all of that. But that's typically done as requested, but it's a tool that is available and has been used from time to time when these are brought to our attention or when a lawyer looks to have the encroachment recognized. But typically I haven't yet come across a situation where a harmless encroachment where the municipality stepped in and required them to remove it. I would imagine there'd have to be a very good reason for that if that were to ever happen.
Thanks, Carl. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up or comments in the chat box. So we won't be going anywhere, but maybe just to, in respect of people's time, we'll just go over our final slide here, and I'll pass it to Nadia just to go over some next steps in the project. But the project team will stay on for a few more minutes before we wrap up if there's any outstanding questions. So next slide, Jill.
Thanks, Matt. So as Anita said, there is the draft discussion paper, which is on the website, and I mean, it is lengthy, but there may be only certain sections that might pertain to you or you might find interesting. So if you're thinking about, adding that deck, adding a story, adding a parking garage, kind of see what could be done. Look at what the issues or themes that we've spoken of today, but other items that Anita referred to, and maybe there's something else that you're thinking of that hasn't been addressed. So we would like those comments on that draft discussion paper by August 20th, and then September we'll have a presentation to Town Council, and then in the fall, we will prepare a zoning strategy report. So we're going to take the items in the discussion paper and sort of dive deeper a little bit into, okay, we've heard, we've received comments, we've had this meeting. What other items do we need to get into? And basically that strategy report will outline some recommendations for the document itself. And then early next year, we'll release the draft zoning bylaw. So that will be open to the public for review, comment. It will include the maps, the schedules. So it will be important for you to check that to make sure that your site is correctly zoned. And then following that public release, we'll have the statutory public open house and the statutory public meeting. Those are two separate meetings that are required under the Planning Act. Can't believe I'm saying winter, but yes, the W word. And we would ask that you provide any comments directly to the project email address, which is on the slide. And that's zoningreview@smithsfalls, 2 S's, .ca. And throughout the whole project, the updates with draft documents and other information will be on the Speak Up Smiths Falls webpage. So we have time, but time does pass. And also, as you're walking around or driving or, sort of thinking about your communities and the places that you frequent, there might be other ideas that come to mind. So you don't need to wait for a specific community engagement event. You can always provide comments, feedback, thoughts through this email address. And, that helps us too, to think about certain things and have those discussions with town staff and have that time to sort of talk about things that maybe we're not thinking of. And so we encourage you to stay engaged. We encourage you to reach out to your networks. Again, we're here to help facilitate, bring best practices, bring other examples, but it is a collaborative effort to make sure that the document reflects maybe some of the issues that have occurred from a development perspective, but also forward thinking through some of those other provisions like shared parking spaces, bicycle parking, and others that maybe we haven't addressed in full detail. So we hope you stay engaged. And really, again, thank you for your time, for participating in tonight's session.
Great, thanks, Nadia. And just for, as we wrap up here, The link is in the chat box as well, and feel free to email the zoning review at smithfalls.ca, and that'll go. I think that goes almost directly to Carl. So we look forward to receiving your comments throughout the project. So the project team will stay on for a couple minutes here, but otherwise this does conclude the zoning issues workshop for this evening. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day.
Thank you.